help you guys along here on our very first unconference discussion session. So there's really no ground rules. I want everybody to feel empowered that they can really reflect on what we just kind of sat and listened to. It was really great to hear a lot of the big steps that SEIU has really kind of put forward as a team. Like, it's a big group of them with the custodial and janitorial staff, and just really fighting for their rights, for safety, and also just in general, their just general well-being. So kind of the layout for this unconference is obviously everybody can't unmute at the same time because we would all talk over each other. It's a little different than us sitting in a room and smiling at each other. So if you have any questions, you can do it one of two ways. You could use the raise hand function, and you're going to find that with the participants window. If you are little participants at the bottom of the Zoom meeting, you could raise your hand. You could also put your question in the chat. I do believe I have Kris and David helping monitor chat to answer questions. And then I have some questions that I just kind of ask the group as a whole. We also have, if you have questions for our presenters, our speakers, you can have those for them as well. So just kind of my first one that popped out, it's an issue that's actually currently in our district. What are some language barriers that you guys are seeing with your, maybe it doesn't just have to be custodial staff. I think Kris made a good point that it's really, we can see this really overflowing in everything in education. But what are some language barriers in regards to training that you are all experiencing? And how are you guys combating that, either with partnership or with discussion with your HR groups? Maybe some solutions. Again, feel free to put in the chat. One of the things that our brains train us is that silence is not acceptable, but it's totally okay. There is silence, and that just lets us have a monologue in our brain. But being one of the bullet points that, and I'm sorry, Solana, I said your name wrong, that they brought up was that that is actually an issue.
We have a substitute custodian that just started, and he is deaf and extremely hard to understand. And so I'm worried, nervous that he probably has not been trained properly. And even if he had questions, it would be hard for him to get those across. Not that I'm saying it's a problem, I'm just saying that that is a new issue for us to deal with.
Thank you, Bev. Yes, I've seen that in our district as well. We have a lot of a population that speaks Russian, and we all use safe schools. It's part of our mandatory training. And that training is not provided in a lot of languages. So how are we making sure that people are getting provided adequate training when we don't know if they're understanding it in their language? So that's something that it definitely, how can someone get in trouble, or how can we prevent them? Most of what we want them to be safe. So how can we prevent injury if they aren't understanding how to prevent that? Any other comments? I have some more questions I jotted down while I was watching, so.
Hey, it's John Allen here, sorry. I was in the middle of eating. With PSE. I used to work in the healthcare field, and coming into this custodial representational work, it occurs to me something that's kind of, at least within a healthcare setting, is kind of, a little ironic that hospitals have contracts with 24-hour, incredibly multi-language translation services that they use for patients who they bill, but who don't seem to provide any of that for their workers who speak, by and large, generally pretty widely spoken languages here in this country. So I think that that's a great, at least rhetorical point, when you're in negotiations with an employer, or whether you're at the legislative table, talking about how these resources are in these buildings already. It just is up to the employers to make these available to everyone.
Thank you for that. Sorry, it's Tabby. I just wanted to interject and say thank you for that comment. That's a really great point.
So what are some things that, as we listened to, they gave us a really great presentation. What are some things that are exciting? Like, what was something that you heard that maybe you didn't know, or maybe it's something that you're like, yeah, I've been fighting this, or I've been struggling this. I'm so excited to know that this hasn't just been going on this year. This has been going on for several years. So what's something was presented that you're like, rock on, let's take that.
I thought it was interesting that the 30,000 square feet, I am going to go find out how many square feet our schools have, divided by how many custodians we have, and see where we fall in that line. I just thought that was an interesting thing. I'd never thought about that before.
Hey, Tabitha, I would say that square footage, as he mentioned, not every square feet of a building is the same. I found that in my 30 years of work, there's a wide variety of what's expected for each square foot. And sometimes getting management to understand that is very, very difficult.
You're very right, Kris. We actually had a custodian at one of our schools tell us that there was sometimes some jobs aren't apples to apples, or they're apple to oranges. It's not even an apple to oranges, it's an apple to steak. They're just not the same at all. And also different people can do tasks in their mind in a different order. So sometimes it makes more sense for them to do certain things in a certain way. But understanding that it's not just about cleaning. And it looks like I have a question from Rich. Or we have.
Yeah, it's just more of a statement. I talked to a custodian in one of our chapters in Eastern Washington. It was at Washington State University. Yeah, they were in a situation over there where it was just a really rough environment because they were in the middle of a desert that was going on. And she had actually made the statement, and this number just keeps coming up in my head, that her supervisor tripled her square footage that she had to clean, and there was no way that she could do it every evening or whenever it was. So she was written up at the end of each evening, not being able to do that. And I'm just wondering if other people have experienced that, or do you normally find that sometimes your work is used against you in that kind of environment?
Well, Rich, I'll speak to that. One thing is telling a substitute not to spend extra hours cleaning because they want to get the job done. and the veterans that are us saying, no, they will use that to make it appear that you should be able to clean X amount of rooms in so many hours. And I've been in a lot of situations where it's every other night cleaning, it's once a week cleaning. And if you are not careful, you can give management a false sense of what it takes to do the job.
If I can make a quick, coming from, this is Ray, I'm with PSC. I've been with PSC for 13 years. Prior to being with PSC, not only as an organizer, but now as a member engagement specialist, I used to work for Kaiser as a custodian of all things, and then became a manager there. The way we based square footage at that time was if they had bathrooms, showers, the square footage would shrink per individual because it's more work. So the square footage wouldn't be 50,000 per custodian, it would be 35, 30, based on the amount of work that they had. And then obviously, as the less bathrooms and showers that they had, the square footage would grow. And we kind of compromised with the worker to see not only how much square footage can you handle, but how much is it fair to do. And the other thing we used to work on is making sure that they had all the supplies needed to be able to be successful in cleaning those facilities, along with their MSDS sheets and the safety training that they needed so they would never get hurt. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Ray. Matt has a comment for us.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. I just wanted to address kind of some of the square footage pieces. Really where I've found the most comprehensive study around square footage and cleaning is with set in a school setting, but it's some pretty old work. I think it was from '98 or so. But we've really moved away from that square footage because, like Kris mentioned, and even more so now in the commercial buildings where they're switching up the workplaces on like sometimes monthly bases, that that's really hard to get a hold of. Plus there's been a whole lot of resistance from the employers to set it by square footage. What we've done with the workload, and as was commented on about people getting written up because they're not able to complete their jobs, is in our CBA, we were able to negotiate where a janitor could speak up saying, hey, I have too much work and I need help. And then by their last shift, if they still see that they can't complete that they're able to contact the supervisor and say, I'm not going to be able to complete this without getting a write-up. Plus, once that happens, it triggers or supposed to trigger a review of their work where the janitorial lead or someone else designated is going to do that route with that janitor and determine if the workload really is too much. So that's kind of one of the ways we've addressed that.
Thank you, Matt. So another kind of question, and feel free if you don't have a question or you don't have an answer to a question I'm asking and you have something else. We have great presenters tonight, or great speakers, and obviously they are just full of knowledge. This is their expertise. But I'm wondering across the board, what feels most challenging to you collectively? What do you think the challenges are going to be getting this bill passed? Or even just in general, getting people on board.
Well, I see Rich has his hand. Oh, his hands are clapping. I think
Great question.
I think telling the stories of what the work is. I spent some time with Lillian Ortiz Self, who is a legislator, and she grew up with both of her parents as custodians in school. And she told me this story. She would wait up for her mom to come home. Her mom would get home at 11, and she would soak her hands in ice water. And nobody knew at this time, 30 years ago, was it the chemicals? Was it the work? But those are the stories that I think we need to share. And I think when we talk to legislators, they need those stories, those real life stories. They don't need the numbers and the statistics other than how much it's going to cost in the budget. But we need to share the true stories of what happens to people who do this work and are not cared for when they do it. My opinion.
I agree with you, Jodi. Years ago, my husband and I were young married with a small child, and I had an income, but we needed another income. So we took on cleaning a school in a district that hired individual contractors per building. My husband was supposed to clean the entire building each night. So not only did it end up being my husband, but myself with an infant on my back, and we had to bring my sister in to also help because there wasn't this Bill of Rights for custodians that took a look at what's really going on and what the real needs are. And so the stories from past also have impact towards going to the future to make sure that people are adequately taken care of and are not getting injured and are not put in situations that it's impossible for them to do a very good quality job.
I think you should also include the impact that the custodian has on the school environment itself. There's one person in that building that everybody knows by their first name, and it's usually the custodian. As a maintenance worker, that's the person I go to get the best information. They're like the middleman to providing the best service for our communities, a safe, clean environment for our children. And I'm just so happy to see that the legislature is willing to hear this demographic and hear and want to take on their problems and make their lives better, because they should be better. Like, nobody should be expected to do double the work that they used to do. Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
I think that you went to it for a little bit, but how much does safety in numbers or no numbers come into play? Most night custodians, at least in our district, I'm in a small district, they work alone. And how safe is that really for them?
So I can kind of jump in and talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so isolated workers are put in, one, they're by themselves working, and so if they get injured, there's issues, but there are also predatory people out there, and especially when you're talking about immigrant workers working nights by themselves in buildings that can really be taken advantage of. In 2019, we passed the Isolated Workers Prevention of Sexual Harassment and Assault, which requires employers to provide with their panic buttons, where they can hit a button, it automatically shows where they're at and can get immediate help. It also includes pieces about sexual harassment and assault training in workers' languages. Right now, that piece is specific to commercial janitors, security officers, and hotel workers. But I definitely think that could be expanded. The farm workers are looking at doing similar legislation. And so there is some talk about really broadening out that isolated worker bill to protect folks. But yeah, we've seen some experiences with that. There's a really great documentary called Rape on the Night Shift. It's about janitors in California and the horrible things that have happened there. And our bill kind of built off of what was passed in California, and Oregon is also moving that legislation as well.
Thank you. Did you address, like in our situation where we are a small district, how you deal with budget issues if I say the custodians shouldn't work by themselves? How a panic button isn't much to offer them, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different situation, and working at a commercial office building in downtown Seattle or Bellevue than a small school district. So, and when we look at the money piece, we're not talking about tax dollars. We're talking about private, investment dollars where there's millions of dollars, and we can point to like there's money right there, and you can spend some of that money, or you can put these workers at risk. So it is a different conversation.
I just want to pop in and champion the training aspect that Matt talked about. There's some things like having comprehensive trainings, and even having employers say clear standards around anti-harassment, and making sure that there are procedures and processes backed by the union or held by the union to support workers. And those things are very close to free. And so I think that's like a whole list of tools that people can access. And so if working in isolation is scary or harmful at your district, or if you have had or know other people that have had experiences of harassment, there's like a whole list of stuff that we can fight for, including the bougie things that they get when they work in commercial fancy Seattle buildings, but also, places that maybe are working with tax dollars, or are, we have some small public hospital districts and behavioral health centers that maybe don't have extra money. We're still fighting for trainings, we're fighting for escalation practices, and we're fighting for other sort of working condition benefits that are low cost, accessible.
Training is so important, and for our employers to see that when they invest that time in training and just time into their employees, how it, not just a seminar, not just a thing where you sit there and like, okay, everyone's checking the box, but just really investing that time in your employees and making sure they're well trained. Not only will you have an employee that really wants to be there and work for you and be a part of your team, but they're going to see that you also care about them, and that they are going to care about you. And in turn, they're going to be safer. They're going to show up to work more. They're going to be like, you know what? I feel great. I feel great about being at work. And they're just really going to want to be about that culture. So I'm a big advocate for training. I think it's really important. I do want everybody to know we have about 6 minutes left. This has been great conversation though, and I really have enjoyed in the chat, reading your guys' notes in the chat has been awesome. And does anybody else, I have a few more leading questions, but anybody else have questions for Sulan or Matt, I said Mike, that they wanted to ask as they're here, and they are our experts in the area of this
I did want to say one thing. I think what the presentation they put together was really nice. I think it's excellent. I think if you can just, them hearing from those who are actually doing the work resonates. Plus, I don't know if anyone knows this, but companies have been utilizing computers as a way to detect how much time it takes you to do the work, which, as you and I know, it's not fact. It doesn't work that way. But this is one way not only to tell legislators your work, but to keep companies from utilizing tools that don't work. So I think this is positive moving forward. I think you all have done a great job, and we're here to support you. So.
Tabby, I'd like to speak here.
Go ahead, Kris.
Okay. One thing we haven't touched on is the difference between a night custodian and a day custodian, especially when it comes to safety, because this also involves paras a lot when you're working with special needs students. And I've heard this a lot from our para educators and custodians, that those students can get violent at times. So there's also that question too, about what can be done to provide training for everybody. The day custodian and a night custodian jobs, slightly different attitudes.
Great point, Kris. There was a question in the chat, which I think is important to get in. What is the next concrete step, or the next step? And then what do we need to do to move this forward? How can we support the overall cause, and how can we be there to be a part of that?
So I think it was already mentioned. Janitors have been in the shadows, with especially working at night, working in isolated places. They're not seeing those stories that janitors have need to be shared more. And so we're going to create opportunities for folks to share those stories with legislators. I was going to say in Olympia, but next year in Olympia, and this year with legislators. But yeah, it's really collecting those stories, getting out of their shadows. I think one thing that the coronavirus has shown is how important that cleaning work is to society as a whole, to the economy as a whole, to keep things moving and people not getting sick. So I think seizing those opportunities to share those stories, and like Rey said, not me, the research guy, talking about it, but actually having janitors out there.
The other thing that I want to add that we have been talking about is wanting to create spaces for janitorial workers to talk to each other, and so that the stories are being shared not only with legislatures, but there's also story sharing amongst EVS workers and janitors and custodians and housekeepers to really build towards that janitorial Bill of Rights, seeing the themes of stories that come up and actually like what are the collective demands we have across our industries, which hopefully that will be coming to us, sooner than 2022.
That's what I wanted to ask about, and I'm always curious about the organizing aspect of it, and there's not enough time to go through the entire process, even though I'd love to do that. But how it is you're making those connections with those custodians that are in the shadows that may not even realize that this Bill of Rights is out there and it's being formed, and how you're reaching out to them and talking to them, hopefully in a normal situation, face to face, boots on the ground when COVID finally goes away. Hopefully it goes away. But yeah, I was wondering how you guys were putting that together.
I can speak for 1199 Northwest. All of the unions are approaching their work in our own ways. For 1199 Northwest, we've been focusing on centering EVS and janitorial workers across our bargaining units in contract negotiations, but also in our joint labor management meetings for probably the past 4 or 5 years. Because we're a healthcare workers union, we have a long history of saying like, okay, we can have one representation of janitorial workers and not necessarily doing enough to center EVS workers. So we've been doing that over the last several years and have many EVS leaders who are on our executive board and who are lead our union in a variety of different settings. So those are the people that would love to come to a leadership meeting with some of your folks and across our table.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm all for reaching across unions.
We have, I apologize. We have one question and it's from Kyle Ricks. Did you want to just ask your question?
I went ahead and just threw it in the chat there.
I saw that, yeah.
It was just mentioning that as I've been listening to this, it occurs to me that simply if you want to look at a business or a building as a working system, like a body or a living organism, really janitorial, EVS, custodial staff, facilities, they're the white blood cells in the system. They're how you're going to keep the building functioning. They're how you keep the building from natural decay that happens when it's not taken care of. They're how you ensure that people that are working there and your clients coming in who can then sue you and destroy your company aren't coming down with disease or infection or side effects of, say, mixing two waxing chemicals incorrectly when you treat the floors and giving everyone migraines, which definitely has never happened in the building I work in. It's one of those things where I wonder how much research has happened and that can get paralleled to argue what the cost is of allowing EVS staff to do their jobs safely and responsibly impacts overall cost of building a new building, which, for private sector is far more expensive than public sector because money comes from taxes there. So that argument doesn't really help where I work so much, but it may help more for, say, private industry in Seattle.
It's probably the best way to get business attention is through economics, if you can show how much it costs them. And economics do come into play in schools. It's just more convoluted. But I agree. If we could show the cost, that might get attention that personal stories are not getting.
Anecdotal stories I think they're very, very effective in I don't want to say in limited cases, but being like, hey, we have this, now here's some facts. I think having a little bit of both, but I just think the anecdotal story is really just people who are doing the job to say, this is what's happening, this isn't what I heard happen, this is what I experienced myself, are really important. So we are at time. We're actually a little over. I love that we're over. It means we had great conversation and I really enjoyed spending my evening with everybody. Another round of applause to our presenters. We thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's great. And what a great kickoff to our unconference week. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And I hope to see you all tomorrow. I'll hop on and see what's going on. And then there's all sorts of events this week and then all Saturday. So really super excited to spend this week with you. And thank you so much for coming today.